and welcome to World Insight, coming to you from Beijing. I'm Tian Wei. The U.S. has long had an open policy that attracted talents from all over the world. About 1 million international students are studying in the U.S. right now, and nearly 4 in 10 of them from China. But a new visa policy puts them in danger of deportation, no longer allowed to stay in the U.S. if all their classes are moved online. That did not sit well with at least 2 top U.S. universities, which asked a court to block the new visa policy. What does it mean for the academic future of international students in the U.S. universities? How's the international community talking about it and taking it? Let's ask our panelists. For more on international students in the U.S., joining us in Beijing, Teng Jimeng, freelance cultural commentator. Also in Beijing, Jessie Young, founder of Providence Academy, who is a graduate from Cornell University last year. In Cleveland, David Leopold, partner of the immigration law group with Elmer and Byrne LLP. He's also past president and past general counsel of the Washington, D.C.-based American Immigration Lawyers Association. In Iowa City, Tim C. Hagel, professor of political science at the University of Iowa. First of all, it's great to see all of you. It's been quite a long time as a result of the pandemic. We will not be able to see each other that often, but finally get reconnected. Thank you for joining our show. I want to ask directly about that question. What does that mean for universities in the United States? Professor Hagel.
That's a very good question, and it's one that universities, and particularly my university, are struggling with at this point. That here at the University of Iowa, we're planning on going online for all our classes after Thanksgiving, so it's the last 2 weeks of the semester, and that's where some of the foreign students have concerns because they may be forced to leave the United States at that point. But even before then, if all of a sudden there's a spike in the infections and the university has to go online sooner, then that could put many of these students, the foreign students, but even the students that are here in the United States, in really a difficult situation in terms of their studies and what they're going to be able to do. And at this point, we just don't know what's going to happen.
We don't know. What about for you, Jessie? Even though you graduated from Cornell University, you are running an international organization trying to provide service and support to Chinese students overseas. I'm sure some of them are facing quite difficult situations right now. What are they telling you?
Yes, absolutely. As we know, the modification of the ICE major affected for those Chinese students and international students from those schools with only online classes for the next semester. And as we know, there is nearly 8 to 10% of U.S. colleges are planning for an online-only course for the next semester. There's a large amount of students are affected by this policy, and it's including Harvard University and also Bowdoin College and also the enormous California state system, which embraces the most number of Chinese students. And students who are already enrolled in these schools are required to transfer out or leave the country. And as we know, it is nearly impossible to transfer to a school with in-person instruction right now because at this moment, in mid-July, there is no transfer admission opened for most of the schools. And also, it's so difficult for Chinese students to leave the country at this moment because they have already probably signed housing contract lease or another monetary arrangements such as car insurance, house insurance. It will cause a lot of monetary troubles for them. And also flights to various parts of the world is extremely scarce and expensive right now, as we know. It's so difficult for them to get flight tickets. And also most countries have banned the entry from the U.S. because U.S. has the most number of coronavirus patients right now. It's just so difficult for Chinese international students. And also for those who stayed in U.S., if they stay in the school, they will also face the threat of being affected by the virus. So I'm thinking that Chinese international students are forced to choose between continuing their higher education or their own personal health. So it's a dilemma for all of the Chinese international students, I believe.
It's a long list of difficulties and challenges you just outlined. And by the way, Chinese students only occupy about 30% of international students inside the United States. There are others coming from all over the world that are facing similar situations. We have noticed some of the latest development. Harvard University and some of the other educational institutions are ready to sue the federal government.
Cornell University announced on Wednesday that it will join Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in a lawsuit which asked a federal court in Boston to block a new visa rule on foreign students. The new immigration policy would bar international students from staying in the U.S. if all their classes are moved online this fall. It also marked an unexpected reversal of exceptions when colleges and universities in March rushed to shutter campuses and move to online classes as the pandemic triggered lockdowns. The lawsuit said the Trump administration skirted the proper rulemaking process and asked the court to strike it down.
Now the details are still need to be clarified, but your immediate reaction to that?
Look, this is an administration that doesn't follow the law. Don't take my word for it. That's what the Supreme Court said in a recent decision on DACA, a case about the young undocumented immigrants in this country. The Supreme Court said to the Trump administration, and it's not the first time, of course, it said this, look, you don't follow the law. You need to follow the law. And it's the same thing here. They're thumbing their nose, the Trump administration is, at the law. And specifically, what law? Well, the rules in place, these are rules upon which universities have relied, students have relied. We're in the middle of a pandemic. They are taking action, by the way, which is not founded in regulation. What came out yesterday or the day before was what we call a broadcast memo from a group called a Division of Immigration and Customs Enforcement called the Student Exchange Visitor Program, SEVP. That's not the force of law. That's not a statute. That's not a regulation. That's a bureaucrat writing a memo. And so, yes, they will sue. And they will most likely get a restraining order on this because it is a violation of the law. Let's be clear about what's really happening here. This is not about education. This is an attack on students, and it's an attack on universities. This is a $40 billion charge to the American economy by Xing out foreign students. And what's really going on here is the Trump administration, which has completely botched the response to coronavirus, is trying to force our universities to reopen. They know full well that many universities rely heavily on the funds that they get from foreign students. And so if they put them in this untenable situation of no funding, i.e. no foreign students versus reopening, they're going to try to get them to reopen. The other thing it is an attack on foreign students who, by the way, bring culture, bring their skills, add to our economy, add to the wealth of our universities, ideas, innovation. I could go on with the amazing things that our foreign students bring. This is a way to cut out legal immigration without changing a word of the law. This is the moniker of the Trump administration. This is what they've been doing since day one. Yeah. And they've been using, in a very cynical way, the coronavirus pandemic, the tragedy that, as just pointed out, we are now the leaders of the world in coronavirus, America is. We've got 130,000 plus tragic deaths to mourn in this country. The other thing it is, it's an insidious attack on the program called Optional Practical Training, OPT. Many of our students that come over here and finish their degree programs spend a year, or if they're STEM students, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, can go on to spend as much as two years plus working for employers, American employers, in their occupation, in their chosen field. What this does, by putting students, foreign students overseas, by mandating that they be overseas because they're taking online programs during a pandemic, they're going to lose, many of them will, their ability for optional practical training. What the Trump administration is doing is trying to blot out student visas and students coming over here to study and punishing our universities, our great universities in this country, if they don't bend to President Trump's will.
Professor Tang from Beijing, I do want to also invite your views too, because you have many talented students that are studying right now in the United States or on their way, in fact, to study in the U.S. or elsewhere in the world. Some of them return to China, some of them stay there, those who studied already in the U.S. So when you heard as an educator about the latest decision by the U.S. side, what's your reaction?
Well, Jianwei, it strikes me as unacceptably abrupt. I mean, this is totally inflexible and completely disregarding of the difficulties created for international students, and especially Chinese students. As you have said, that almost, 400,000 students, Chinese students studying in the United States, accounting for almost half of the international students. As we say, that there are 1 million international students studying in the U.S. And so it caused considerable and additional stress and sadness. It's like taking their education away from them that is promised in the first place. And also the kind of severance from this very nation that many of my students feel so much emotionally, basically so attached. The United States has been a country that has been nice to the world. I myself have been 2-time Fulbright scholars in the States. It's a very considerate, it has a very considerate institution, very considerate faculty on university campuses. Now this very administration is cutting off, basically it's cutting off and causing this frustration that leaves students very frustrated, if not angry. I ask my students in USC, in University of North Carolina, at NYU, they were all actually thrown into this very chaos.
Right.
In Chinese culture, chaos is such a negative term that one finds itself trapped in a situation, for example, like COVID-19. It adds this very frustration, a new frustration, an additional stress to them right now.
You all have expressed your views from different perspectives. Those are very important views I hope the policymakers will consider. However, Professor Hagel, there have been arguments talking about what exactly is the purpose of this policy. Some suggest universities, according to the Secretary of Education in your country, have been blaming universities and schools being quote-unquote lazy and not want to open the universities and schools because they don't want to, the educators meaning, find a new way to deal with the COVID-19. And therefore, the policy is only to encourage schools to open and think inventively and also think about it innovatively. Professor Hagel, do you think that is really the purpose?
Well, it's hard to say what the purpose is, and certainly different people have different views as to what it was. Mr. Leopold expressed some ideas along those lines. Other people have a different view. Obviously, the administration would disagree, and so forth. As far as the universities are concerned, or let's say education more generally, here also you have different views on things. As far as grade school and high school things, people want them to open in part because students want to be able to, or students and their parents want them to be able to socialize and get that education that they need to get out of the house and so forth. And of course, then it means that parents can go back to work if their kids are taken care of. At the university level, at least at my university, we want to open. We want to have the students there, and I would personally like to have face-to-face instruction rather than to just go online. And of course, we had in the spring semester great disruption where in the middle of the semester, when the pandemic was in its early stages and there was great concern as far as how it was going to unfold, that we immediately went to online, and that caused again a great disruption. A lot of the students didn't like it, didn't do as well, and as far as instructors are concerned, they were sort of discombobulated as well. So we want to open as well, and there are financial considerations, and Mr. Leopold touched on this a little bit too, not just for the international students, but just generally, that we, the universities, that part of their funding comes from tuition, not all of it, of course, especially for example at the University of Iowa, we're a state school, so we get a certain amount of state funding and grants and things of that nature. So there are many factors that go into this, and it's very difficult in terms of dealing with all of these at once. But on the other hand, what are we going to do as far as the pandemic is concerned? Because you've got sort of the push-pull of, well, we want to open, but we want to be safe at the same time.
Yes, exactly.
How do we handle those two things? How do we balance those things?
Jesse, I do want to ask you about that. Now, there are several options the students now on campus could have. Either they go back to their own country, which there could be difficulties of transportation, or they can also enroll in their universities back at home. I understand there are some kinds of arrangement between American university and Chinese university in an emergency. What should be the way out? Do you know and heard some from of your friends?
Example of my mother school, Cornell University. Actually, Cornell University proposed a model of hybrid studies. It established online study system and also established partnership with many local Chinese universities, such as Tsinghua Universities, Peking University, and also Shanghai Jiao Tong University, Fudan Universities. So Cornell undergrad students can choose to study in these Chinese universities with in-person instruction, and also take some of the online classes meanwhile. So it fits the right now's modification, and I think it's a great model for the hybrid study system for Chinese international students. And also I'm thinking about probably based on example of Cornell, many of the universities in America can learn from this model, and also they can together design a very special model for international students.
Professor Teng, finally, before we go, I know you and many other professors from Chinese universities are also trying to offer the best for students, not only here in this country, but international students coming to study in China. Tell me about some of the immediate plans you are trying to come up with in order to deal with this emergency.
Well, right now, actually, I've been receiving kind of invitations to teach online and also in-person classes on campuses in Beijing. We have American colleagues actually telling us that there were almost 300 Chinese students who are supposedly studying in the fall semester in the U.S. now actually are stranded because of this policy in Beijing, in China in general. And so we have to put together a class, a kind of impersonal class. And once again, there's also lots of uncertainties because in September, maybe we here in China may not be able to teach this impersonal class. But one thing for sure is that we will organize this kind of a class for these students now kind of being left behind in China. And so a class will be offered and a class will be taught to them, and various courses now are being available. I'm actually collecting syllabi for students and different courses and put together a team of professors now in various universities here in Beijing so that we can offer this these various courses here in Beijing in the fall.
Right. Turbulent time, gentlemen. Of course, you've been all trying your best to try to help with those in need. Thank you so much for your service, and also be well. Teng Jimeng, Jesse Yang, David Leopold, and Timothy Hagel. Thank you. Really appreciate it.